Hey guys, welcome to That Florida Feeling. How is everybody today? I hope it's been a good day. I know it's still really, really hot. And it's starting to get more into the rainy season, so there's those fun afternoon showers. But I hope everybody's been having a good time. I know that it is almost August. Can you believe that? Gosh, it feels like this year's gone by fast. But I guess as you get older, that's how it feels. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like it should be August. I don't know. Okay, enough about me complaining about being old and time flying. I hope everybody's had a good week, though. Thank you for everybody who has interacted with the Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. And guess what? We have YouTube. That's right, you guys. You can find That Florida Feeling on YouTube now. Granted, I have one video telling you I'm on YouTube, but we're getting there. It's another fun step in, I don't know, some direction. But yeah, we have a YouTube now. So please check it out. Please subscribe. I'll be posting videos on there probably at least weekly till I get the hang of it. So forgive me if the first few videos are less than stellar. It's a learning process, kind of like the podcast has been. But thank you for that. And thank you for everybody who's reached out, who's tagged me in their videos and posted memes on Facebook. And you guys are just awesome. I love it. Thank you so much. Like I always say, this podcast wouldn't be here without you guys. So thank you. Today, I want to talk about something that I've honestly did not even know about until I was looking for something else. You know how you go researching and you go down a rabbit hole and you find something you didn't even realize had ever happened or you'd never heard of. And that's today's topic. And I'm talking about the Ocoee Massacre. Again, if I'm saying Ocoee wrong, I'm sorry. Ocoee was a mass racial violence event. We're going to call it an event. It was a massacre. A white mob attacked numerous African-American residents in the town of Ocoee, which is located in Orange County, which is just outside of Orlando. The massacre took place on November 2nd, 1920, the same day as a U.S. presidential election. Now, I had honestly never heard of this. And after reading it, it's up there with Rosewood. It really is. So let's talk about what led up to this event. So, of course, Orange County, as most of Florida was at this point, was dominated by Southern white Democrats. Or Dixiecrats, as they used to call them, which I think is hilarious. But Southern white Democrats basically ruled Florida. And they had since the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. And they were getting ready for another presidential election in 1920. And in the weeks leading up to this, the African Americans thought that the South were registering to vote in record numbers. African Americans throughout the South were registering to vote in record numbers. And this kind of bothered some people. Now, this is also happening at the same time as the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, was gaining momentum again. They were having kind of a revival, you could call it, which I don't know that I'd want to call it a revival. And they had established a lot of new chapters throughout the South since 1915, so only about 5 years prior. And in the weeks before the election day, the KKK had warned many African-American communities that not a single, and this is how they put it, not a single Negro would be permitted to vote. So they were going to stop these people from voting, even though record turnout to register to vote, which they were legally right to do. They were going to stop them somehow. Judge John Moses Chaney, a Republican running for the U.S. Senate from Florida, had started a voter register campaign to register the African Americans to vote in Florida because they had supported the Republican Party since the Reconstitution, after the Civil War and after their freedom. Now, Moses Norman and July Perry were both prosperous African-American landowners in the area near Ocoee. And they were really the ones leading this charge. They were definitely giving the local voter registration efforts in Orange County, and they were paying the poll tax for those who couldn't even afford it, because back then you had to pay a poll tax to vote. And they knew that a lot of people back then couldn't afford it. So these people were paying it. They wanted these people to be able to vote. So this pissed a lot of people off in that part of Florida. Like we said, it was run by a lot of white people, and this really upset the KKK. And in an effort to preserve they had a white one-party rule, so they only wanted the whites to be able to rule. The KKK marched in absolute full regalia, so robes, banners, you name it, through the streets of Jacksonville, Daytona, and Orlando. And they were doing this to intimidate their opponents. And the organization even threatened Judge Cheney prior to the election. So they just threatened this guy, like, you need to stop running. You need to just walk away. Now, Sam Salisbury was the police chief in Orlando, Florida. He was a native of New York, Salisbury, so he wasn't actually from Florida, but he had come here. He was police chief in Orlando. He was a native of New York, and he had also served in the U.S. military, and he was known as Colonel Sam Salisbury. He was also a white supremacist and a member of the Ku Klux Klan, so you can already tell he's one-sided. Salisbury bragged about his involvement in the violent oppression and intimidation of African Americans who were attempting to vote in the previous elections. So this guy is not impartial. He is not good as a police chief. He sounds honestly like a dick. And he was even one of the leaders in the events that led up to the Ocoee Massacre. I hate to say this, but he was injured in the attack that was led on July Perry's home in Ocoee, and that's probably not a bad thing. So what happened? Well, it's election day. African Americans met with resistance from the white community when they attempted to vote on election day. Poll workers even challenged whether they were registered to vote. They thought that they had faked their voter registration papers, and they didn't believe that they were really registered to vote. So the voters had to prove that they were registered by appearing before the notary public, R.C. Bigelow, who was regularly sent on fishing trips so that he was impossible to find. So basically, in order to prove that you could vote, you had to go to the notary, but then the notary was never where he was supposed to be. So they were making it impossible for these people to vote. However, African Americans, including Mose Norman, persisted, and they kept going to the polls, and they kept going, and they were pushed and shoved, and they were removed violently, and they were trying to keep them away from the polls. So Norman contacted Judge John Cheney, who told him that the interference for the voting was illegal, and to write the names of the African Americans who were denied their constitutional rights, as well as the names of the whites who were violating them. So this judge wanted a list of names. Norman returned to the polling place in Ocoee with a shotgun. He didn't care. He was going to vote. It was his right, and he wanted to vote. Whether the shotgun was taken from him is not entirely clear, but the whites at the polls drove Norman off using his own shotgun. That's just sad. That's absolutely sad. And of course, as he continued to try, the white community got upset, and they began to form a mob, and they started to parade down the streets, and they continued to grow disorderly and unmanageable. And of course, doesn't say this, but we can all assume that there was alcohol involved. And the rest of the African Americans gave up on trying to vote and left the polling place after Norman was run off and this mob continued to grow. Now, later in the evening, on the same day of election, the same election day in that evening, Sam Salisbury, the former chief of police of Orlando, was called to lead a lynch mob, and they were going to find Mose Norman. They were going to find him, they were going to hang him, and they were going to show that what he had done was inexcusable. Salisbury later bragged about his part in these events. So the white mob is formed. They're probably heavily drinking. They're recruiting people, probably from nearby areas. They're mad, and they're just on the hunt. And the white mob was on its way to Norman's house when someone informed them that their target had last been seen at the home of July Perry. So the mob, which is now numbering somewhere near 100 people, arrived at Perry's house demanding that Perry and Norman surrender themselves. They knocked on the door, and they received no answer, so they attempted to break down the front door. Perry, who had already been warned about the mob, fired gunshots from inside the home in self-defense. Now, they don't exactly know how many people were defending this house because, of course, history is written by the winners or the idiots, so we don't really know. But the whites estimated that there were several armed African Americans. Zora Neale Hurston wrote that Perry was defending his home alone. Sam Salisbury knocked on the door and was shot in the arm. He was the first white casualty. Too bad he wasn't shot a little bit further inside. Two other white veterans, Elmer McDaniels and Leo Bogart, were also killed when they tried to enter through the back door. Their bodies were later found in the backyard. So the white mob withdrew, and they put out a call to reinforcement. They wanted all the whites in Orlando, Apopka, Orange County. They wanted them to get there, and they wanted them to help them. They'd either called them on the phone or just sent cars to go get people. So during this time, there was a 2 to 3 hour lull while they were getting other people and more men to help them in their mob. July Perry, though, had been injured in the conflict and attempted to flee with the help of his wife into a cane patch. Unfortunately, he was found by the white mob at dawn and arrested. After Perry was treated at the hospital for his wounds, he was taken by the white mob from a vehicle and transferred to the jail. They lynched him and left his body hanging from a telephone pole beside the highway. Norman was never found. Much of the trouble was attributed to actually from the outsiders. So not people from Ocoee, but people who had come from like Winter Garden to Apopka and Orlando to this town. Doesn't it sound a lot like Rosewood? So Ocoee is raised at that point. I mean, the white mob just took over. More people had come, so now their numbers are way more than 100. They took the conflict to the rest of the African American community in northern Ocoee, and they just destroyed it. The white forces surrounded the northern black community and just laid siege to it, and they were acting in a paramilitary manner. They set fire to rows of houses, and those inside were forced to flee, and many of them, as they fled, were shot. 20 buildings were burned in total, including every African American church, schoolhouse, and lodge room in the vicinity. African American residents fought back in an evening-long gunfight that lasted until 4:45 in the morning. Their firearms were later found in the ruins after the massacre had ended. Eventually, black residents were driven into nearby orange groves and swamps. They were forced to retreat until they were driven out of town. They didn't want them in this town anymore. The fleeing sought refuge in surrounding woods or neighboring towns such as Winter Garden and Apopka. And both Winter Garden and Apopka also had substantial populations of black people. So it's really strange that all these people that came from Winter Garden to Orlando and Apopka only attacked Ocoee. And I guess it's because of Perry and Norman. But it just seems... I'm glad it was an isolated incident. It just seems strange that they didn't attack their own town, which I'm glad they didn't. So the fleeing people sought refuge, and they were able to be safe. And the siege on Ocoee claimed numerous African-American lives. Langmaid, which was an African-American carpenter, was beaten and castrated. Maggie Genlack and her pregnant daughter died while hiding in their home. Their bodies were found partially burned underneath it. Roosevelt Barton, an African-American hiding in July Perry's barn, was shot after the mob set fire to the barn and he was forced to flee. Hattie Smith, who was visiting her pregnant sister-in-law in Ocoee when her sister-in-law's home was set on fire. Smith fled, but her sister-in-law's family was killed when they hid and waited for help that just didn't come. So they have completely razed Ocoee at this point. They're not even giving them a chance, and that's stupid. African-American residents of southern Ocoee, while not direct victims of the massacre, were also threatened into leaving. They wanted anybody and everybody out of their town. Annie Hameter, an African-American woman residing in southern Ocoee, she could also be referred to as Miss J.H. Hameter, suspected that the massacre was planned so that whites could seize the property of prosperous African-Americans for nothing. According to Hameter, the people in southern Ocoee were coerced by the threat of being shot or burned if they didn't sell out and leave. 500 African Americans, roughly, in total, were driven out of Ocoee in rapid succession, resulting in the population becoming nearly all white in a very short amount of time. That fall, the white residents had to work the harvest and the citrus crops because all the black laborers had fled their region, and nobody settled in the area again for some 60 years later. Nobody came back in that area until 1981. Subsequent events for the massacre. July Perry's body was found riddled with bullets and swinging on a telephone pole by the highway. According to the Chicago Defender, his body was left near a sign reading, "This is what we do to..." I'm not going to say the word, but you imagine there's a very bad slang word. "This is what we do to blank that vote." Another source said that he was hanged near his home of a judge who had supported the black voter franchise. A local photographer was selling photos of Perry's body for 25 cents each. What a absolute scumbag. Several stores placed the photos on exhibit by their windows. Dear Jesus, what is wrong with you people? And of course, no one was prosecuted for his murder. No one was going to tell on each other. Perry's wife, Estelle Perry, and their daughter were wounded during the shooting at their home, but survived. The authorities were sent to Tampa for treatment that involved they wanted them away from them. They wanted no further disturbance. Walter White of the NAACP arrived in Orange County a few days after the riot to investigate the events. He was traveling undercover as a white northerner interested in buying an orange grove in the county. Probably a smart man. Although, Walter White, I wonder if he was making drugs at that point. Sorry. He found that the whites were still happy with victory over their events. A local real estate agent and taxi driver told him that about 56 African Americans were killed in the massacre. Of course, we don't know the actual number. White's NAACP report reported about 30 dead. A Methodist Reverend, J.A. Long, and a Baptist minister, Reverend H.K. Hill, both from Orlando, reported that they had heard of about 35 African American deaths in Ocoee as a result of the fires and shootings. Charles Crow, in 1970, finally decided to talk about the event and described that he had seen 12 dead. A University of Florida student who interviewed local residents for a history term paper claimed in 1949 that about 35 were murdered, and that's a common estimate by the old-timers still living in the town. Of course, the exact number can never be determined. White also learned that many black residents through the massacre was due to the white community's jealousy of the prosperous African Americans, such as Norman and Perry. So they were right. They were jealous of the African Americans doing better. And they didn't think that they had that right. Unfortunately, no one was held responsible to any of the violence. Agents of the Bureau of Investigation, which would later become the FBI, showed up weeks later, but they made it clear they weren't investigating for murder, arson, or assault. They were only interested in election fraud. The leader of the mob later became the mayor of Ocoee. Supporters in the House Election Committee of Congress investigated the riots and voter suppression in Florida with a view to suing under the 14th Amendment, but it failed. This is a horrible, horrible moment in Ocoee's history and in Florida's history. Of course, estimates say 30 to 35, but we don't know. And it is true that most of the African Americans who were killed owned buildings and residences in northern Ocoee. And it really did turn Ocoee into an all-white or sundown town. The massacre has actually been described as the single bloodiest day in modern American political history. All because they didn't want them to vote. You know? I think it's great that July Perry and Norman both were standing up for what they believe in. I think it was their right, and they knew it. And, you know, it's really, really sad. And what's worse is most of the people living in Ocoee today probably don't even know that this has happened. They probably don't realize that they live in a place where that happened. A lot of people obviously don't talk about it, or it was never shared through oral history. The people that were excited that it happened are long gone, happily, and it was never passed down, whether it was through the fact that they realized that they were absolute idiots, or was just something that wasn't talked about. There has been some remembrance of the massacre. In 1969, Lester Dabbs, the future mayor of Ocoee, wrote his master's thesis on the massacre. In the 1990s, the Democracy Forum and West Orange Reconciliation Task Force, made up of Ocoee and Orange County residents, organized discussion to explore the events and honor the victims. On Martin Luther King Day in 2010, the town of Ocoee sponsored a commemoration that included a keynote from Professor Paul Ortiz from the University of Florida, the author of the history of events that occurred on that election day in 1920. At 10:30 a.m. on July 21st, 2019, a historical marker honoring July Perry was placed in the Heritage Square outside of the Orange County Regional Historical Center. Melissa Farrell, a Central Florida native, also a William and Mary Law student, wrote a piece exploring the details of the tragedy, including the concealment and property loss, the fact that they did not even address that this had happened. And there have been many other, People are not going to let this go away, and I think that's great. In 2018, the city of Ocoee did finally release a proclamation acknowledging the massacre, and a formal apology to its descendants is in the works. Dude, that was years ago at this point. The Florida legislature has also passed a law requiring that the Ocoee Massacre be taught in Florida schools. In June 23, 2020, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill which directs the Commissioner of Education and African American History Task Force to determine ways in which the 1920 Ocoee Election Day riots to be included in African American history. On October 3rd, 2020, the Orange County Regional Historical Center also opened a landmark exhibit. Yesterday, this was home. The Ocoee Massacre of 1920, recognizing the 100-year mark of the massacre. I can't say that other word. It includes the original research, an interactive land deed map of black landowners showing where they would have been, a testimony of family descendants, and a full series of educational programming about the event. On November 2nd, 2020, 100 years after the massacre, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis proclaimed Ocoee Massacre Remembrance Day. So people aren't going to let this be forgotten, and I think it's a very good history. We don't need to let history die. We need to remember that this is not how we need to act. And that's just really sad. All they wanted to do was their constitutional right to vote. And not only were they killed over it, but people were displaced and threatened and ran out of their homes because of it. History's doomed to repeat itself if you don't study it. So, I was not aware of this massacre. I knew of Rosewood. I thought that was probably the only one in Florida. Apparently, I was deeply wrong, and I may find another one, and I'll do a podcast episode on it, because I don't think this history should be forgotten. I think that these people were absolutely wronged, and I'm really sad that that happened in history. It just bothers me to think that people act like that, you know? So, no Florida man. I think we've talked enough about a Florida man. That police chief or any of the people in that mob are probably worse than Florida man. Sorry for the sombering podcast, but again, I don't think history should be forgotten, and it is a part of Florida. So if you visit the Orange County Historical Regional Center, go see that exhibit if it's still up, or go look for that commemorative plaque for July Perry, who only stood up for what he wanted. All right, guys, next week I promise we'll have a funner topic. Is funner even a word? I don't know. We'll have a more interesting, I don't know. We'll have a topic. It won't be as sad, I promise. But thank you for listening. Thank you for learning about more of Florida's history with me. I hope you guys have a great week. Don't forget to drink water. It is still super hot. I got in my car and it was 115 degrees showing. Of course, that's just because my car was sitting in the sun. But still, dear Lord, that is way too hot. Also, don't leave your pets in the car. Don't leave your kids in the car. Don't take your pets on walks outside in the scorching heat. Okay, don't do that. But I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for learning another part of Florida's history. I hope that, I don't know, I just hope everybody has a great week. Don't forget to check out the YouTube. If you have a second, reviews are appreciated. And as always, guys, that's your daily dose of sunshine.